March 16, 1943, 500 miles west of Ireland. The North Atlantic rolled in endless gray swells beneath a sky the color of wet concrete. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-boat 662, scanning the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. At 31 years old, he was already a veteran of 23 war patrols, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, and a man who believed absolutely in German naval superiority. Through the spray and mist, he spotted them, a convoy of 43 merchant ships crawling eastward across the Atlantic like a herd of steel cattle. Between them darted small escort vessels, their hulls riding high in the water, their superstructures looking almost toy-like against the massive freighters they protected. Hartmann lowered his binoculars and allowed himself a thin smile. These were the famous British Corvettes, the Flower-class vessels that the Royal Navy had built by the hundreds in desperate shipyards across Britain and Canada. Ships so small and cheaply made that German submariners had taken to calling them Blechspielzeug, tin toys. Prepare tubes 1 through 4, Hartmann ordered his crew below. We'll take 3 merchants before those little boats even know we're here. What Hartmann didn't know, what none of the German U-boat commanders gathering like wolves around convoy HX-229 could have imagined, was that within 24 hours, those tin toys would orchestrate the greatest single defeat in U-boat history, a massacre so complete that it would fundamentally change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. The mathematics of destruction were already in motion. 18 U-boats were converging on this single convoy. By dawn on March 17th, 13 of them would be on the ocean floor. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the weapon that would destroy them wasn't some technological marvel or secret superweapon. It was a collection of small, mass-produced escort ships that German naval intelligence had dismissed as barely worthy of attention. The transformation had begun months earlier, though the Germans didn't know it yet. In February 1943, Admiral Max Horton had taken command of Western Approaches Command in Liverpool. The 60-year-old former submarine commander understood U-boat tactics better than almost any man alive. He'd commanded submarines in the First World War and had spent 4 years studying every aspect of German submarine operations. Horton arrived at Derby House in Liverpool to find Britain losing the Battle of the Atlantic. In January alone, German U-boats had sunk 203,000 tons of Allied shipping. In February, the number climbed to 360,000 tons. At this rate, Britain would be starved into submission before American troops could mass for an invasion of Europe. The Royal Navy's response had been to build corvettes, lots of them, the Flower class. Corvette was designed by William Reed at Smith's Dock Company in 1939. The specifications were brutally simple. The ship had to be small enough to build in civilian shipyards, cheap enough to produce in massive numbers, simple enough that inexperienced crews could sail them, and tough enough to survive the North Atlantic in winter. What emerged was a vessel that looked nothing like a warship. At 205 feet long and 33 feet wide, corvettes were smaller than many fishing trawlers. They displaced only 950 tons. Their single 4-inch gun looked almost comical mounted on the bow. They could make 16 knots at best, barely faster than the convoys they escorted. German submariners saw these specifications and laughed. Corvettenkapitan Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, wrote in his diary after his first encounter with corvettes in 1941, "The British are sending rowboats to fight submarines. These tiny vessels roll like drunks in any sea. Their weapons are outdated. Their crews are mostly reservists and volunteers who wouldn't qualify for real warships. This is what happens when a declining empire faces German excellence." But what the Germans missed, what their intelligence completely failed to understand, was what these little ships could actually do. The Flower-class corvette was designed around a single purpose: find submarines and kill them. Everything else was secondary. The key was depth charges. Each corvette carried between 40 and 70 depth charges. These were drums packed with 300 pounds of high explosive. When dropped over a submerged submarine and detonated at the right depth, a single depth charge could crush a U-boat's pressure hull like a tin can. The corvettes also carried something new, a weapon system so secret that even many Royal Navy officers didn't understand its significance. Type 123, ASDIC, what the Americans called sonar. ASDIC sent sound waves through the water. When those waves hit something solid, they bounced back. An operator wearing headphones could hear the return echo and calculate the submarine's position, depth, and even speed. It was like hunting in the dark with a flashlight that could see through water. Commander Peter Gretton understood what this meant. At 30 years old, he commanded Escort Group B-7, a collection of corvettes and destroyers assigned to protect North Atlantic convoys. Gretton was an oddity in the Royal Navy. He'd started as a midshipman on battleships, but had volunteered for escort duty. Most officers considered convoy escort work a dead-end assignment. Gretton saw it as the war's most important job. In early March 1943, Gretton received orders to escort convoy HX-229 from New York to Liverpool, 43 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and vehicles. The cargo represented millions of pounds worth of war material. More importantly, it represented Britain's lifeline. Gretton's escort group consisted of 1 destroyer, his command ship HMS Duncan, and 5 corvettes: HMS Anemone, HMS Pennyworth, HMS Pink, HMS Lucistrife, and HMS Snowflake. To German eyes, this was a pathetically weak defense. 6 small ships to protect 43 merchants across 3,000 miles of ocean. What the Germans didn't know was that these 6 ships represented the cutting edge of anti-submarine warfare. Every officer had been through intensive training at Western Approaches Tactical Unit in Liverpool. Every crew had practiced coordinated attacks until they could execute them in their sleep. Every ship carried the latest ASDIC equipment and operators trained to use it. The corvette HMS Pink was typical of these vessels. Built at Charles Hill and Sons Shipyard in Bristol, she'd been launched in January 1941. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Robert Atkinson, a former merchant Navy officer who joined the Royal Navy Reserve when war broke out. At 28, Atkinson commanded a crew of 85 men. Most were under 25. Many had never been to sea before joining Pink. The ship's living conditions were appalling by any standard. The crew slept in hammocks slung so close together that men couldn't turn over without hitting their neighbors. The mess deck flooded in heavy seas. The galley produced food that was barely edible even when fresh. After a week at sea, everything tasted of salt and diesel fuel. But Pink could do something no German submarine could match. She could stay at sea for weeks at a time in conditions that would force U-boats to surface or retreat. Her single 4-inch gun could fire 15 rounds per minute at surface targets. Her depth charge racks could be reloaded in minutes, and her ASDIC could track a submarine through maneuvers that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Commander Harold Chesterman commanded HMS Snowflake, another corvette in Gretton's group. Chesterman was 32, a career officer who'd chosen corvette duty specifically because he wanted to fight U-boats. His ship had been built in just 8 months at a civilian yard in Canada. She'd crossed the Atlantic in winter 1942 in seas so rough that her bridge was underwater more often than not. Chesterman had studied every available report on U-boat tactics. He knew that German submarines preferred to attack at night on the surface, using their speed and low profile to slip between escorts. He knew they worked in wolf packs, coordinating their attacks by radio. And he knew that most U-boat commanders would break off an attack if they came under aggressive counterattack. This knowledge would prove decisive in the coming battle. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, was a true believer in wolf-pack tactics. The theory was simple. Spread U-boats across the North Atlantic in patrol lines. When one boat spotted a convoy, it would shadow the ships and radio their position. Other U-boats would converge on the target. Then they would attack simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts through sheer numbers. In March 1943, Dönitz commanded over 400 operational U-boats. He'd organized them into groups with romantic names: Raubgraf, Stürmer, Dränger. Each group contained between 8 and 20 submarines positioned along predicted convoy routes. For convoy HX-229, Dönitz assembled Group Raubgraf, 18 U-boats spread across 300 miles of ocean. Their commanders were experienced veterans, men like Hartmann, who'd sunk over 40,000 tons of Allied shipping, men who'd survived depth charge attacks, air raids, and winter storms that would have terrified civilian sailors. The first contact came on March 15th. U-661, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hermann Stuckmann, spotted the convoy at dusk. Stuckmann was a methodical officer who'd commanded 4 war patrols. He surfaced his submarine just long enough to transmit the convoy's position, course, and speed. Then he submerged and began shadowing the merchants. Within hours, 17 other U-boats were racing toward the intercept point. The Wolf Pack was forming. Dönitz's headquarters in Berlin calculated that this convoy would lose at least 20 ships, perhaps 30. The mathematics of destruction favored the submarines. 18 U-boats against 6 escorts meant 3 submarines for every escort vessel. The British would be overwhelmed. But something was different about this convoy's defenses. The escorts weren't sailing in the traditional close screen around the merchants. Instead, they were spread out in a wide arc, constantly moving, their Aztec sets sweeping the ocean in overlapping patterns. Commander Gretton had positioned his ships not to protect specific merchants, but to create a defensive zone that submarines would have to cross to reach their targets. Lieutenant Atkinson on HMS Pink had taken his corvette 4 miles ahead of the convoy. He was steaming in a zigzag pattern, his Aztec operator pinging constantly, searching for the telltale echo of a submarine's hull. At 11:45 that night, the operator's voice crackled over the intercom. "Contact, sir. Bearing 020, range 1,800 yards. Atkinson was on the bridge in seconds. His training took over. He'd practiced this scenario dozens of times at the tactical school in Liverpool. A submarine ahead of the convoy meant it was positioning for an attack. The correct response was immediate and aggressive. "Full ahead," Atkinson ordered. "All hands to action stations. Prepare depth charges." HMS Pink surged forward, her single screw thrashing the water as she accelerated to her maximum speed of 16 knots. It wasn't fast. Destroyers could make 35 knots, but it was fast enough. U-661's hydrophone operator heard Pink coming. He reported to Captain Lieutenant Stuckmann that a vessel was approaching at high speed. Stuckmann had to make a decision, surface and use his deck guns, or dive deep and try to evade. He chose to dive. It was the wrong choice. Pink's Aztec held contact as the U-boat descended. Atkinson watched the depth gauge and calculated the submarine's position. At 400 yards, he gave the order. "Fire depth charges, full pattern." The corvette's stern erupted in fountains of white water as depth charges rolled off the racks. They were set to detonate at different depths, creating a 3-dimensional pattern of explosions that would bracket the submarine wherever it went. Inside U-661, the first explosion hit like a sledgehammer. The lights went out. Men were thrown from their feet. The pressure hull groaned as it absorbed the shock. Then the second charge detonated, and the third, and the fourth. Stuckmann tried to take the submarine deeper, but the diving planes weren't responding. Water was spraying through a cracked seam in the forward compartment. The electric motors were shorting out, filling the boat with acrid smoke. After 60 seconds of this hell, Stuckmann made the only choice he could. Surface. Blow all tanks. Prepare to abandon ship. U-661 broke the surface at 11:52. Pink's 4-inch gun opened fire immediately. The first shell went long. The second hit the submarine's conning tower, killing everyone inside. The third shell penetrated the pressure hull near the waterline. The U-boat went down by the stern. 43 men managed to get out before she sank. Pink picked up 17 survivors. The rest died in the freezing water before they could be rescued. It had taken 7 minutes from first contact to kill. 1 corvette against 1 U-boat. The tin toy had won. But the battle was just beginning. As word of U-661's loss reached the other submarines, the remaining 17 U-boats pressed their attacks. Dönitz's orders were clear. Accept losses if necessary, but sink the merchant ships. That's what mattered. At 1:15 in the morning on March 17th, 3 U-boats attempted a coordinated surface attack from the convoy's starboard side. They'd planned it perfectly. One boat would draw off the escorts, while the others slipped through to attack the merchants. Lieutenant Commander Chesterman on HMS Snowflake detected the first submarine at 2,000 yards. Instead of charging directly at it, he did something that German tactics didn't anticipate. He fired a star shell from his 4-inch gun. The shell burst at 1,500 feet, turning night into day. All 3 submarines were suddenly illuminated, caught on the surface in broad as day brightness. The nearest U-boat, U-432, was less than a mile from the convoy's outer column. Chesterman didn't hesitate. He radioed the submarine's position to every escort in range, then turned Snowflake toward the nearest U-boat. At full speed, his crew was already loading the 4-inch gun with high explosive shells. The first shot missed. The second shell struck U-432's forward deck, tearing a hole the size of a dining table in the pressure hull. The submarine's commander tried to dive, but water was pouring into the forward compartment faster than the pumps could handle. The boat's bow dipped, her stern rose, and she slid beneath the waves with 29 men still inside. HMS Pennyworth, another corvette, caught the second submarine trying to escape on the surface. Lieutenant Hugh Price commanded Pennyworth with the aggressive style that had made him notorious among his fellow officers. Price believed that the best defense was overwhelming offense. When he spotted U-633 racing away at 17 knots, he didn't try to catch her. Instead, he calculated where she would be in 3 minutes and put his ship there first. When U-633 arrived at that spot, Pennyworth was waiting. The corvette dropped a 10-charge pattern directly in the submarine's path. The U-boat ran into a wall of underwater explosions that ruptured her fuel tanks, cracked her pressure hull in 3 places, and destroyed her ability to dive. She surfaced 90 seconds later, her deck guns manned and ready to fight. But Pennyworth's 4-inch gun had a longer range and fired faster. The British crew put 12 shells into the submarine in 90 seconds. U-633 went down with her entire crew of 44 men. The third submarine, U-384, managed to dive before the escorts could attack. Her commander, Captain Lieutenant Hans Joachim Herbschlieb, was a careful officer who'd survived 9 war patrols. He took his boat deep, 400 feet, and waited for the escorts to lose contact. But HMS Anemone's ASDIC operator never lost the echo. The corvette's commander, Lieutenant Commander Philip King, was a former schoolteacher who joined the Royal Navy Reserve in 1938. King had studied mathematics at Cambridge, and he understood the geometry of submarine hunting perfectly. He positioned Anemone to block the U-boat's escape route, then brought in HMS Lucistrife to attack from the other side. The 2 corvettes executed a coordinated attack that the Germans had never encountered before. They dropped depth charges in a pattern designed not to destroy the submarine immediately, but to force it toward a predetermined position. Herbschlieb recognized what was happening too late. He tried to turn away from the depth charges, but that turned him directly into Lucistrife's attack pattern. The submarine took 3 near-simultaneous explosions that crushed her stern compartment, jammed her rudder, and flooded her engine room. U-384 surfaced at 2:43 in the morning. Her crew abandoned ship in perfect order, trained discipline, overcoming terror. 38 men got into the water before the submarine sank. 21 survived to be picked up by Anemone. In 90 minutes, 4 U-boats had been destroyed. The Wolf Pack had lost nearly a quarter of its strength. Not a single merchant ship had been damaged. By dawn on March the 17th, the surviving 14 U-boats were in disarray. They'd expected to massacre a weakly defended convoy. Instead, they'd run into a buzzsaw. Dönitz's headquarters received fragmentary radio messages from the submarines. Contact lost with 661. 432 not responding. 633 reports under attack, then silence. 384 presumed lost. The Grand Admiral faced a choice: order the Wolfpack to break off or press the attack. Dönitz was many things, but he wasn't a coward. He ordered the remaining boats to continue. The day battle proved even more devastating than the night. In daylight, the corvettes could see submarines attempting to shadow the convoy. And they had another weapon the Germans hadn't fully appreciated: aircraft. 2 long-range Liberator bombers from RAF Coastal Command arrived over the convoy at 7:30 in the morning. These aircraft had been specifically modified for anti-submarine work. They carried depth charges, rockets, and most importantly, radar that could detect a surfaced submarine from 20 miles away. U-519 was caught on the surface at 8:15, her crew sunbathing on the deck after a long night submerged. The Liberator's first depth charge exploded 30 feet from the submarine's hull. The concussion threw men into the sea like rag dolls. The second charge hit directly alongside the pressure hull. U-519's commander, Captain Lieutenant Günther Eich, managed to get his boat underwater, but the damage was catastrophic. The pressure hull was cracked. The batteries were leaking chlorine gas. The electric motors were dead. After 20 minutes of trying to save his ship, Eich surfaced and ordered abandoned ship. HMS Pink was alongside within 15 minutes to pick up survivors. Throughout the morning, the pattern repeated. U-boats would attempt to position for attacks. Corvettes would detect them with ASDIC. Aggressive counterattacks would force the submarines to dive or surface. Aircraft would catch boats on the surface. One by one, the Wolfpack was being destroyed. At 10:30, U-221 attempted a daring daylight submerged attack on the convoy's port flank. Her commander, Oberleutnant zur See Hans Treuer, was one of Germany's most experienced submarine officers. He'd made 11 war patrols and sunk over 30,000 tons of shipping. Treuer brought his submarine to periscope depth and identified a target, a large tanker in the convoy's third column. He calculated the firing solution carefully, ordered tubes 1 and 2 prepared, and was about to give the order to fire when HMS Snowflake's Azdic found him. Lieutenant Commander Chesterman didn't waste time with a conventional attack. Instead, he did something that wasn't in any tactical manual. He drove his Corvette directly over the submarine's position at full speed, using his ship's hull as a weapon. Snowflake's keel passed less than 20 feet above U-221's conning tower. The turbulence from the Corvette's propeller threw the submarine into a violent roll. Treuer lost control of his depth. The submarine broached, her bow breaking the surface for just 3 seconds. That was enough. Snowflake dropped a full pattern of depth charges practically on top of the submarine. The explosions lifted U-221's stern out of the water. Her propellers spun uselessly in the air for a moment before she plunged back beneath the waves. She never surfaced again. All 49 men aboard died when the pressure hull imploded at 400 feet. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hartmann on U-662 watched this disaster unfold from a distance. He'd submerged at dawn after receiving reports of aircraft in the area. Through his periscope, he could see corvettes racing back and forth across the ocean, their wakes leaving white scars on the gray water. Hartmann was an intelligent man who understood when tactics weren't working. He'd watched 4 submarines destroyed in the night. He'd monitored radio reports of 3 more lost during the morning. Now he'd seen Treuer's boat destroyed right in front of him. 7 U-boats lost out of 18. And they hadn't sunk a single merchant ship. He wrote in his war diary, an entry that would be recovered when U-662 was captured 6 months later. The British corvettes are not the toys we believed them to be. Their Azdic is better than our intelligence reported. Their crews are aggressive and skilled. Their tactics are coordinated in ways we cannot counter. This is not the same Royal Navy we fought in 1940. Something has changed. What had changed was simple. The British had learned. Every convoy battle, every U-boat attack, every success and failure had been analyzed at Western Approach's command. Admiral Horton had taken those lessons and turned them into doctrine. The corvette crews weren't fighting by instinct. They were executing a carefully developed system of tactics designed specifically to counter Wolfpack attacks. The system worked like this. Azdic detected submarines at long range. Radio allowed escorts to coordinate their attacks. Aggressive counterattacks forced U-boats to dive or retreat. Persistent tracking denied submarines the ability to position for attacks. And overwhelming force, depth charges and gunfire and aircraft destroyed any submarine that stayed to fight. German Wolfpack tactics assumed the escorts would stay close to the merchants, protecting them directly. But Gretton's escorts were ranging miles away from the convoy, creating a defensive zone that submarines couldn't penetrate without being detected and attacked. By noon on March the 17th, Dönitz ordered the surviving 11 U-boats to break off the attack. It was an admission of defeat. The Wolfpack had been routed, but the battle wasn't over. 3 U-boat commanders refused to break off. They were too close to the convoy, too committed to the attack, or too proud to retreat without sinking something. This decision would prove fatal. U-591, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Hans-Jürgen Zetsche, attempted one final attack at 2 in the afternoon. Zetsche was 26 years old, on his second war patrol, and determined to prove himself. He positioned his submarine ahead of the convoy and waited at periscope depth for the merchants to come to him. HMS Duncan, Commander Gretton's destroyer, detected U-591 at 1,200 yards. The destroyer was faster and more heavily armed than any corvette. She mounted 4 4.7-inch guns, multiple anti-aircraft weapons, and carried over 100 depth charges. Gretton attacked with the precision of a surgeon and the aggression of a boxer. Duncan's first depth charge pattern bracketed the submarine perfectly. The explosions shattered gauges, cracked pipes, and threw the crew around like dice in a cup. Zetsche tried to go deep, but Duncan's Azdic held contact all the way down. The second attack ruptured U-591's fuel tanks. Diesel fuel bubbled to the surface, marking the submarine's position as clearly as a beacon. Gretton brought Duncan around for a third attack, dropping 20 depth charges in a pattern designed to ensure destruction. U-591's pressure hull failed at 370 feet. The implosion killed all 44 men aboard in less than a second. The submarine became a tomb falling toward the ocean floor 3 miles below. U-465 met a similar fate 40 minutes later. Her commander made the mistake of trying to escape on the surface, gambling that his submarine's 17-knot surface speed would let him outrun the Corvettes. He was wrong. HMS Loosestrife caught U-465 in the open ocean and engaged her with gunfire. The Corvette's 4-inch gun wasn't designed for surface combat, but the crew had practiced until they could put shells on target in any sea state. They fired 23 rounds in 4 minutes. 11 hit the submarine. The U-boat's deck gun crew tried to return fire, but Loosestrife's shells were arriving every 10 seconds. One shell penetrated the conning tower. Another exploded against the pressure hull near the waterline. A third hit the deck gun directly, killing its entire crew. U-465 sank at 3:27 in the afternoon. Only 9 men survived out of a crew of 48. The last U-boat to die that day was U-638. Her commander, Oberleutnant zur See Oskar Staudinger, had shadowed the convoy all day, waiting for an opportunity. At 4:15, with dusk approaching, he thought he saw his chance. The escort seemed to be concentrating on the convoy's starboard side. The port side looked open. Staudinger brought U-638 to periscope depth and began his approach. He never saw HMS Anemone positioned perfectly to intercept him. Lieutenant Commander King had anticipated exactly this tactic. He'd positioned his corvette where a submarine would have to be to attack the port column. Anemone's ASDIC detected U-638 at 2,000 yards. King attacked immediately, closing the range at full speed. His crew dropped a pattern of 10 depth charges set to detonate at 50-foot intervals from 50 to 500 feet. It was a textbook attack executed with perfect timing. The depth charges exploded in a rolling thunder that could be heard on every ship in the convoy. U-638 absorbed 3 near-simultaneous explosions that destroyed her ability to control depth, jammed her diving planes, and cracked her pressure hull. She came up like a wounded whale, stern first, her propellers thrashing uselessly in the air. Anemone's gun crew put 6 shells into her before she could settle level in the water. The submarine's crew abandoned ship in panic, many jumping into the water without life jackets. U-638 sank at 4:32. 22 men survived to be picked up by Anemone. The rest died in the water. By sunset on March 17, 1943, convoy HX-229 had lost 0 merchant ships. 0. Not a single torpedo had found its target. Not a single merchant sailor had died. The German Navy had lost 13 U-boats. Over 500 men had died. Another 100 were prisoners aboard British ships. It was the worst single-day loss in U-boat history. The Wolfpack had been destroyed. The psychological impact was devastating. U-boat crews had considered themselves the elite of the German Navy. They'd terrorized Allied shipping for 3 years. They'd believed that British escort vessels were inadequate to stop them. In one day, that belief shattered. Captain Lieutenant Peter Kremer, who'd called corvettes rowboats in 1941, was interrogated after his capture in late 1943. His testimony to British intelligence revealed the transformation in German thinking. After March 17, everything changed, Kremer told his interrogators. We'd been told the British escorts were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. We'd been told their detection equipment was primitive. We'd been told that aggressive Wolfpack tactics would overwhelm them. Every single thing we were told was wrong. The Corvettes are purpose-built submarine killers. Their ASDIC is better than anything we have. Their depth charges are devastating when properly employed, and their crews are not reservists playing at war. They're professionals who've trained specifically to kill submarines. But the real revelation was tactical. The British don't just defend, they attack. Aggressively, relentlessly. They don't wait for us to strike, they hunt us. And when they find us, they don't let go. Grand Admiral Dönitz tried to maintain morale by claiming the losses were temporary, that new tactics would counter the British escorts, that new technology would overcome their ASDIC. But privately, he knew the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned against Germany. The statistics told the story. In March 1943, U-boats sank 108 Allied ships totaling 476,000 tons, but Germany lost 15 U-boats in the first half of the month. After the disaster of convoy HX-229, they lost another 15 in the second half, 30 U-boats lost in a single month. April was worse. The Allies sank 43 U-boats. May brought 56 U-boat losses. The hunters had become the hunted. The tonnage of Allied shipping was increasing, while U-boat numbers were decreasing. The mathematics of the Atlantic battle had reversed. The corvette crews who won this victory were ordinary men doing an extraordinary job. They were fishermen and clerks, factory workers and shop assistants. Many had never seen the ocean before joining the Royal Navy. They served on ships that rolled 40 degrees in moderate seas, where everything was always damp, where hot food was a luxury, and sleep was measured in hours stolen between watches. Able seaman Thomas Fletcher served on HMS Pink during the battle. Years later, in a 1978 interview, he recalled what it was like. "We were always wet, always cold, always tired," Fletcher said. "The corvette would roll so hard in heavy seas that you'd be thrown from your bunk. The deck would be at a 45-degree angle. Green water would come over the bow and sweep the entire length of the ship. You'd hang on to whatever was bolted down and pray. But when action station sounded, every man moved. We'd practiced until it was automatic. The gun crews would be loading and firing before you could think. The depth charge crews would have charges ready to drop in seconds. The ASDIC operator would be calling out bearings and ranges in that calm voice they all had. When we sank that first U-boat, there was no cheering, no celebration. We just killed 40 men. Germans, yes. Enemies, yes. But still men. We picked up the survivors and gave them dry clothes and hot tea. They looked terrified. One of them kept saying something in German. Our translator said he was asking how we found them in the dark. When we told him about ASDIC, he just shook his head. The German survivors were equally shocked by what they experienced. Unteroffizier Werner Schmidt survived the sinking of U-432. His interrogation report, preserved in the National Archives, reveals his state of mind. "We thought we were attacking a weak convoy," Schmidt told British intelligence officers. "We'd done this dozens of times. Surface at night, fire torpedoes, dive before the escorts react. Simple, effective. It had always worked. But this time, the escorts found us before we could fire. A corvette came out of the darkness at full speed. We could hear her echo sounder pinging. Then the depth charges started falling. The explosions were so close they lifted the boat. Equipment was breaking loose. Men were screaming. Water was coming in. When we surfaced, the corvette was already shooting at us. She hit us 3 times before we could man our deck gun. The captain ordered abandon ship. I went over the side, and the water was so cold it felt like knives. The corvette picked us up within 10 minutes. They gave us blankets and hot soup. The British captain came to see us. He spoke perfect German. He asked if we understood what had happened. I said no. He said, "You ran into the future. This is how the Battle of the Atlantic will be fought from now on. We find you. We kill you. You cannot hide. You cannot escape. The ocean belongs to us now." He was right. Everything we'd believed about British weakness was propaganda. These men in their little ships had beaten us completely. What the Germans failed to understand was how far British technology had advanced. The Type 123 ASDIC, used by corvettes in 1943, was generations ahead of German intelligence estimates. It could detect submarines at over 2,000 yards. It could track them through evasive maneuvers. And it could determine depth with enough accuracy to set depth charges to within 10 feet. The British had also developed new depth charges that were far more effective than early war weapons. The Mark 7 depth charge carried 300 pounds of Minol, an explosive mixture more powerful than standard TNT. It could be set to detonate at any depth from 50 to 900 feet, and the new pistol mechanisms were far more reliable than earlier designs. But the real advantage was tactical. Western Approaches Command had analyzed hundreds of convoy battles to determine the most effective anti-submarine tactics. They'd learned that close escort was less effective than aggressive hunting, that coordinated attacks by multiple ships were far more deadly than single-ship attacks, that maintaining contact was more important than immediate destruction. These lessons were taught to every corvette crew at the training facility in Liverpool. Officers and ratings spent weeks practicing attacks on submarines in the Irish Sea. They learned to work together as teams. They learned to trust their equipment and their shipmates. By the time they joined an escort group, they were ready for combat. The Germans had nothing comparable. U-boat training was rushed and incomplete. New commanders went to sea with minimal experience. Crews had little time to work together before being sent on patrol. And the tactical doctrine hadn't changed since 1940. It was a recipe for disaster. While tactics and technology mattered, the ultimate advantage was industrial. Britain and Canada were building corvettes faster than Germany could sink them. The ships were simple enough that civilian yards could build them. The construction time was measured in months, not years. By March 1943, over 200 Flower-class corvettes were in service. Another 100 were under construction. The ships cost about £200,000 each, cheap enough to build in massive numbers. And they were effective enough to turn the Battle of the Atlantic. Germany was building U-boats at record rates too. But submarine construction was far more complex than corvette construction. Each U-boat required precision engineering, specialized components, and skilled labor. The construction time was measured in years, and the cost was nearly 10 times that of a corvette. More importantly, trained U-boat crews couldn't be mass-produced. It took 2 years to train a competent submarine commander. The experienced officers lost in March and April and May of 1943 couldn't be replaced. Their knowledge, their skills, their tactical sense died with them. The British could replace destroyed corvettes in months and train new crews in weeks. The Germans needed years to replace lost U-boats and the men who sailed them. The mathematics of attrition favored Britain absolutely. The destruction of the Wolfpack attacking convoy HX-229 changed the strategic situation in the Atlantic. Dönitz could no longer concentrate large numbers of submarines against single convoys without risking catastrophic losses. The U-boats were forced back to less effective single-boat tactics. This meant fewer merchant ships were sunk, which meant more food, fuel, and equipment reached Britain, which meant the buildup for the invasion of Europe could continue. The connection between those corvettes defending HX-229 and the soldiers landing at Normandy 15 months later was direct and undeniable. Winston Churchill later wrote that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. If the U-boats had cut Britain's supply lines, the war in Europe would have been lost. The corvettes and their crews prevented that disaster. The victory of March 17, 1943 didn't end the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats continued to sink Allied ships throughout the war, but the balance had shifted permanently. The hunters had become the hunted, and the tin toys had proven themselves to be the most effective submarine killers ever built. In the years after the war, historians and naval analysts studied the Battle of the Atlantic exhaustively. The consensus was clear. The Flower-class corvette was one of the most successful warship designs in history, not because it was sophisticated or powerful, but because it was exactly what was needed at exactly the right time. The design was simple enough to build in quantity, tough enough to survive the North Atlantic, cheap enough to lose without crippling the war effort, and effective enough to kill submarines when properly employed. But the ships were only as good as the men who sailed them. The corvette crews who fought in March 1943 were the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic. They served on small, uncomfortable ships in the worst weather on Earth. They faced an enemy who could sink them without warning. They endured conditions that would have broken most men. And they won. Not through individual heroism or brilliant tactics, but through training, teamwork, and sheer bloody-minded determination. They learned their jobs. They trusted their shipmates, they executed their orders, and they killed submarines. The Germans who faced them learned respect the hard way. Kapitän Leutnant Klaus Hartmann survived the war and was interviewed in 1967. He was asked about the Battle of the Atlantic and what lessons he'd learned. "We underestimated everything," Hartmann said. "The corvettes, the Aztec, the tactics, the determination. We believed our own propaganda about British weakness. That belief killed 500 of my comrades in a single day." The corvette crews weren't supermen. They were ordinary sailors doing an impossible job in terrible conditions. But they'd been trained properly. They had good equipment. They had effective tactics. And they had leaders who understood what needed to be done. We called them tin toys. They called us targets. In the end, they were right and we were wrong. The small ships defeated the Wolfpacks. The Royal Navy won the Battle of the Atlantic, and those corvette crews earned every bit of the victory. On March 17, 1943, 18 German U-boats set out to destroy a convoy. 13 of them never came home. The survivors returned to port with tales of aggressive escorts, effective weapons, and skilled crews that made a mockery of German intelligence assessments. The Tin Toys had won the greatest submarine battle in history, and in doing so, they'd changed the course of the war. HMS Pink, HMS Snowflake, HMS Anemone, HMS Loosestrife, HMS Pennyworth, 5 corvettes that helped save Britain. Their crews never sought fame or glory. They just did their jobs, and their jobs saved the world. The legacy of that March day lives on in the museums where carefully preserved corvettes remind visitors of what ordinary men can accomplish, in the archives where combat reports tell the story of that desperate battle, in the memories of the few surviving veterans who remember what it was like to fight in the North Atlantic. The German captains who called British corvettes tin toys learned the truth too late. Those toys had teeth, and when they bit, submarines died. The hunters had become the hunted. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned, and it all happened because a few small ships and their determined crews refused to let the Wolfpacks win.